None of these explanations of the brain-mind relationship are viable. The brain does not create the mind. The brain does not receive signals like a TV. And the brain is not in a field that gives rise to both the physical realm and to the mind. So that begs the question, does the brain perform any functions? Is the brain necessary for us to be able to live in the physical realm? And I'm going to be suggesting that it is not. These are the reasons. Near-death experiences see and hear clearly, but the brain is not functioning. Dr. Bruce Grayson, who's professor of psychiatry and neurobehavioral sciences at the University of Virginia, did a series of studies, studied several hundred near-death experiencers. 47% described clearer thinking than in their normal waking state. 38% described thinking faster than usual. 29% described thinking as more logical. And 17% described that they had more control over their thoughts than they usually have. So that's happening when the brain is not functioning. So the brain is not necessary to any of those acute senses that they were experiencing. Another reason we know that the brain is not necessary is that removing half the brain doesn't disturb the mind functions. People who have had half their brain surgically removed in hemispherectomies function almost perfectly normally. The mind doesn't lose part of consciousness when half the brain is removed. The operation has been performed hundreds of times. Even after half the brain is removed, patients retain their personalities and memories. They reason normally, they interact as they always did, and they otherwise are the same people that they were before the hemispherectomy. A study of children who underwent hemispherectomies found that they often performed even better in school afterwards. Another reason that we know that the brain is not necessary is that people function normally without a brain. Dr. John Lorber, Sheffield University Medical School professor, identified several hundred people who have very small cerebral hemispheres, but who appear to be normal, intelligent individuals. Some of them he describes as having no detectable brain, and yet they've scored up to 126 on IQ tests. The condition of having a fluid-filled cranium is called hydrocephalus. It results in the accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid inside the skull. During infancy, it keeps the brain from growing, so the person has diminished brain tissue or no brain tissue. A University of Sheffield student who was academically bright had an IQ of 126. A CAT scan showed he had less than 1 millimeter of cerebral tissue from hydrocephalus. That's about the thickness of a fingernail. The student lived a perfectly normal life and went on to gain an honors degree in mathematics. I want you to meet Sharon. Sharon's a delightful woman, and Sharon has a remarkable story to tell. She has severe hydrocephalus, and she has virtually no brain tissue. In spite of that, she is a staff nurse, married with 3 children. She graduated from school, passed every exam that she took. She had more than average intelligence, and she was the only girl in the school to receive a graduate certificate in chemistry, and only one of 2 girls to receive one in biology. This is Sharon's brain. You notice that there is a dark area in the middle of her skull that is cerebrospinal fluid because of her hydrocephalus. On the outside of that is a very thin sheet of material. But in spite of that, Sharon was able to perform perfectly normally. Dr. Sheffield described that these are the areas of her brain that are missing, the areas of motor control, hearing and vision, registering sensations such as hot, cold, or touch, speaking, understanding spoken words, and all of the frontal cortex. And it isn't that that thin sheet of material could have taken over and performed those brain functions. The parts of the brain that are missing mean that the functions are not going to be performed. There is no way that they can be performed by a thin sheet of material. But this is Sharon. I want you to meet Sharon because she's a delightful woman. This is Sharon speaking about her situation.
It's a bit scary actually when you see it in black and white.
Has anyone at school ever talked to you about it?
Well, generally they don't talk to me about it, I talk to them. Because it fascinates me, and if it fascinates me, well, it'll have to fascinate them as well.
How do they react to you telling them what it is?
They're just amazed. You know, they're astounded.
Do you ever wonder whether you're trying to prove anything to yourself?
I sometimes get that feeling because I'm the world's worst. If somebody tells me I cannot do a thing, if they tell me I'm not good enough to do a thing, I will go ahead and just prove them wrong on purpose.
Why?
Because I like to show them that I know what I'm capable of. And if I say I'm capable of something and they say I'm not, I generally get the upper hand and prove that I am capable.
Another reason we know that the brain is not necessary to functioning is that people with deteriorated brains revive before passing and have lucid periods. And the brain is not there. The brain has been deteriorated to the point where it couldn't function, and yet they become lucid. They spend as much as a day or two being completely lucid. Dr. Bruce Grayson, professor of psychiatric medicine, studied this phenomenon. It's called terminal lucidity. He studied 83 cases of terminal lucidity. They were people who had brain abscesses, tumors, strokes, meningitis, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, schizophrenia, and mood disorders. They had complete recovery of consciousness just before death, had a lucid period in which they conversed as though they had never had a single thing wrong with them, as though they were completely healthy, and then passed away. That would have been impossible with the brains as they were. One study in the UK found that 70% of caregivers in nursing had observed patients with dementia and confusion become completely lucid in the hours before death. So this is not an unusual occurrence. This is very common. These are scans that show you what happens in a deteriorated brain. A normal brain is on the left. You can see that the oranges and the greens and the yellows are functioning areas within the brain. Early Alzheimer's disease is in the middle. You can see the purple areas in the middle. Those are not functioning. They're gone. They're no longer there. They can't function. And on the right side, that is advanced Alzheimer's disease. You can see all of the purple areas. That brain is, for all intents and purposes, dead. It's not functioning. This is another view of what it's like when a person has a deteriorated brain. A brain with advanced Alzheimer's is on the right side. You can see the deterioration. It's actually shrunken, and you can see the holes in it. This is a description of it. The cortex shrivels up, damaging the areas involved in thinking, planning, and remembering. Shrinkage is especially severe in the hippocampus, an area of the cortex that plays a key role in the formation of new memories. And the ventricles, that are fluid-filled spaces within the brain, grow larger. And yet the person is able to revive and have a lucid period. It's called terminal lucidity. This is one example. A 42-year-old man had a malignant, rapid-growing brain tumor. He was bedridden, blind in one eye, incontinent, had incoherent speech, and bizarre behavior. He was unable to make sense of his surroundings. When a family member touched him, he would slap them as if he were slapping an insect. He stopped sleeping and talked deliriously throughout the night. And then one night, suddenly, he became calm and spoke coherently. He slept peacefully without the nightly outbursts. The following morning, he talked with his wife calmly and coherently. He discussed his imminent death for the first time. And later that day, he stopped speaking and died. Terminal lucidity would be impossible if the brain were necessary for the mind to function, because the brains were damaged. They couldn't possibly have been lucid at that period. But the mind outside of the brain is functioning well. It's completely coherent. It's always healthy. And so the mind outside of the brain was able to have a period of being lucid in which the mind operated the body, was able to calmly talk about the situation, about the imminent death, and then it would pass away. Terminal lucidity shows that the brain is not necessary. Another indication that the brain is not necessary is that people's bodies react to images before the brain has access to the images, can know what the images are. A large number of studies now have been done. The first of the studies were done by Dean Radin, who's the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. He had people sit at a computer monitor that showed calm pictures of pastoral scenes, neutral household objects, and emotional pictures of erotic and violent scenes. They were selected at random by a computer. Skin conductance is a measurement of how tense a person is. This would measure whether the viewers felt stress at seeing the emotional pictures and calm when shown the calm pictures. What he found, and many have found since then, is that people were reacting as early as 6 seconds before the computer selected and showed the pictures. That would have been impossible if the brain had to be involved, because the body, with the electrodes on it, was reacting before the brain even had access, before the computer had chosen the pictures. So the body, in other words, was responding to the mind, which is outside of the body, didn't need the brain involved at all. Another reason we know that the brain is not necessary is that savants display motor skills that the brain could not provide. This is an example. Derek Amato. Derek was 40 years old when he hit his head hard after diving in a shallow pool. He had memory and hearing loss as a result. A few days later, he sat down at the keyboard a friend had, and with no musical ability, he immediately played beautiful, fully structured, original music that he was composing. What he said was, "My fingers began to scale the piano keys as if I had played all my life. I can't explain the feeling of awe that came over my entire being." He was called a spontaneous savant. If Derek Amato's mind had been produced by the brain, Derek would not have suddenly been able to play the piano and to originate his own music. It's only possible if the mind is outside of the brain, the mind doesn't rely upon the brain or the brain's learning, and the mind is able to acquire this skill suddenly in ways that we don't fully understand. And then the mind was able to have the body perform by being able to play music on the piano and compose music. But that can only happen if the mind is not created by the brain, the mind is outside of the brain. Another reason we know that the mind is outside of the brain, is not created by the brain, is not housed in the brain, is that people function normally right after leaving the body. We have communication from people who have left their body. They are in what we call the afterlife, and they describe to us what happens to them immediately after leaving the body. Leslie Flint was a direct voice medium in the 20th century. Direct voice means that the voice that we're hearing comes from the people who are not using bodies, who are in what we say is the afterlife, to communicate without using the medium's own voice mechanism. Flint was tested hundreds of times by researchers, magicians, skeptics, and scientists using very tight controls. But the voices came regardless of the controls, regardless of where it was. It could have been in a hotel room, and he was never found to be a fraud. And so we have the records of people coming through Leslie Flint, and we have the recordings of them now. And we can listen to those recordings, and they're describing what happens to them on the other side when the body stops functioning and they continue with their life. Alf Pritchard is one example. He was a British World War II soldier. Pritchard came through Leslie Flint and described running out of the trenches into no man's land. He was firing at the Germans, but they didn't seem to notice him. He ran right past them. He had been killed suddenly on the battlefield. His mind continued functioning as it had when he was in a body, leaving him to believe that he was still fighting on the battlefield. But we have that record of Alf Pritchard continuing to run, continuing to function without using a body after the body had been destroyed on the battlefield. Another example is Ted Butler, who came through Leslie Flint. He had been crushed against a wall by a runaway truck. He described seeing his own crushed body on the road, getting into the ambulance with his wife, and going to the funeral. About the funeral, he felt it was all very nice, but it was so damn silly because there I was. Ted Butler was able to continue living without using the body immediately after he had passed. He was still on the earth plane, he was still functioning on the earth plane, got in the ambulance with his wife, went to his funeral, but he was not using a body in order for that to happen. Another reason we know that the mind is not dependent upon the brain and the brain is not useful for the mind's functioning is that people can have changes in their characteristics, their whole personalities, suddenly. They can take on a whole new personality. A story is told by Larry Dossey, M.D. He described in his book, One Mind, the case of Iris Farkzady, a well-educated, mathematically gifted Hungarian girl, who at the age of 15 suddenly insisted that she was Lucia Alvarez de Salvio. She began speaking in fluid Spanish. She couldn't understand her native Hungarian anymore. She was able to dance the flamenco, sang popular songs in Spanish, and said that she hated the upper classes, and she had no understanding of mathematics. But the woman we know as Iris was mathematically gifted. She insisted that she lived and died in Madrid and that she had 14 children. That sudden change in personality, which was lasting, could not have happened if her mind had been confined to the brain, if the mind had only gotten what the brain had learned during a lifetime. But in fact, Iris suddenly changed. She became a whole new personality. Everything about her, including her language, changed. So in other words, the mind outside of the brain was using Iris's body, but that was not the mind that she had begun with as Iris and had grown up with as Iris. That could only happen if the brain was unnecessary and the mind was functioning outside of the brain. Another reason we know that the mind does not need the brain, that the brain is not necessary for functioning, is that a non-material mind cannot cause electrical, magnetic, and chemical activity. Dr. Pim van Lobel in the Journal of Physiology, Journal of Neurophysiology, and the Truth Journal, International Interdisciplinary Journal of Christian Thought, wrote, "How can a non-material activity, such as concentrated attention or thinking, correspond to an observable material reaction in the form of measurable electrical, magnetic, and chemical activity at a certain place in the brain? Even an increase in cerebral blood flow is observed during a non-material activity such as thinking. That couldn't happen if the mind had to use the brain for functions." Another indication we have that the brain is not necessary to the mind's functioning and to the mind's influencing the body is that no electricity travels over the sensory nerves, the optic nerves, the auditory nerves, those nerves that carry impulses that you would expect to have electricity going over if the senses were involved. In other words, the physical realm was being accessed by the sensory nerves into the brain. Thomas Heimberg, Associate Professor of Biophysics at the Niels Bohr Institute at the Copenhagen University, and Andrew D. Jackson, Professor of Theoretical Physics at Copenhagen University, performed studies in which they attempted to find out how much electricity was going over the sensory nerves during a sensory experience. Their attempts to detect the heat from electricity when the impulses were traveling along nerves to produce sensory experiences failed. In other words, they found no heat, which indicates that there was no electricity going along those nerves. The physical laws of thermodynamics tell us that electrical impulses must produce heat as they travel along the nerve, but their experiments have found that no such heat is produced. What that means is that there are no electrical impulses going from the eye to the brain or from the ears to the brain. You would expect that to be true if the brain were necessary to having the experience of sight and the experience of sound. But the finding was that there were no electrical impulses, which means that the brain was not involved in having the experience of sight and the experience of sound. And that's going to have profound implications for the nature of reality. And that is something that I'll be concluding at the end of this presentation. Another reason we know that the brain is not necessary is that the heart actually sends more signals to the brain than the brain sends to the heart. In other words, the heart is communicating, it's going about its business without having the brain involved. The brain is apparently not necessary. Another indication that the brain is not necessary to the mind's functioning was found by Mario Catenis at the University of Edinburgh. They did a series of studies in which they took EEGs of brains of a person seeing a light flash. They had a receiver in another room. This person was just sitting in another room and was there expectant to receive something mentally. Within 200 milliseconds of a flash, both had an increase of brainwave activity. However, the receivers reported feeling nothing. In other words, these reactions were occurring without having the brain involved at all. The brain didn't know what was going on, was not receiving those flashes. Another indication of the fact that the brain is not necessary to the mind is that the brain shows activity after the body has already registered. Studies published in the Journal of Alternative and Complementary Medicine showed that the subjects' heartbeats were sensing oncoming harsh or pleasant sounds before they came. Their hearts felt the future before it had even happened. Even though the brain and the body as a whole are involved in processing the stimulus, it appeared that the heart gets there first. In other words, the brain was not necessary. Other studies that show that the brain is not necessary to the mind's functioning were performed by S. James Spottiswoode, who was the director of research, and Edwin May, who was executive director, both at the Cognitive Sciences Laboratory. What they found was that bodies were reacting to sudden loud sounds before the sounds happened. They were measuring body functions and body reactions, and they found that the bodies were reacting before the brain had access to that information. Other studies that were done by Benjamin Livet, a Ph.D. neurobiologist at the Medical Center of the University of California, showed that people were aware of being touched a few thousandths of a second after the touch, but the brain didn't register the touch until after that. In other words, the brain wasn't necessary to registering the touch. In other studies performed by Livet, the part of the brain that governs movement was ready to raise a finger or a hand before the brain made the decision, by an average of a half a second. In other words, the brain was not necessary. The mind was communicating with the body before the brain was even involved. So we know that the brain is not involved in having experiences or functioning. Hemispherectomies, in which half the brain is removed, don't disturb mind functions. People without a brain from hydrocephalus function perfectly normally. People with dementia and other such disorders in which the brain is completely deteriorated can revive just before passing and have lucid conversations and then pass away. People who've transitioned out of the body function better than in the body. We know that from near-death experiences. And people react to pictures seconds before the brain is involved. The brain is not necessary to function. So that begs the question, why do we have a brain at all? We can get the answer by looking at the next realm, the realm that we call the afterlife. And we can see what it's like in that realm, what life is like there, and compare that to life in this realm. And what we find is that in this realm, the earth realm, we have to have props, we have to have scenery, we have to have reasons for things. So if something happens, then it was because of something that happened in the past. That's not necessary in other realms. It's only part of the earth realm. I'll give you some examples. One of the things that happens is that on this plane of life, we have to have a sun to give us light. We need to get light from the sun. But in the next realm, there is no sun. There's no need to have a sun. There's an ambient source of light. It's always available, so that light simply is there. We have the experience of light without having the cause. The same thing is true about warmth. The sun provides warmth on this plane of life. On the next plane of life, the temperature is always ambient. It's always pleasant. And so there's no reason for a sun to give warmth. There simply is warmth. It's not necessary. Another characteristic of the earth plane is that we have stars and galaxies and background radiation to show that the universe is vast. On the next plane of life, there is no need for that. And as a result of that, the people there don't refer to vast areas of space. Another indication is that there are molecules and atoms and subatomic particles on the earth plane. They exist to show that matter is made up of something. On the next plane of life, buildings can be constructed through the power of thought. Another indication, travel on the earth plane requires that we make some effort, such as we have to walk, or we have to get in a car, or we have to get in a plane. But travel on the next plane of life doesn't require that at all. All a person has to do is intend to be someplace, and is that place automatically. So travel is not necessary. There is no space. Space is part of the earth plane. It's part of the scenery here. Another indication, we have organs that are necessary to support the body. And so we have to have a liver, and we have to have a heart, and we have to have kidneys. But the residents of the next plane of life that they call Summerland have remarked that they don't believe they have organs, that organs are not necessary. They simply live, they sustain themselves without having organs. Another indication, people on the earth plane have to eat to sustain what we experience as a body. On the next plane of life, there's no need to eat or to drink. The body is sustained with no energy input. It's only on the earth plane that we need to have that. It's part of the scenery. Another indication, on the earth plane, the body has to die to move from one focus or plane to the next. In other words, we've got to get rid of the body so that the mind can move away from the body into the next plane of reality. But on the next plane of reality, movement into different life experiences or places just occurs seamlessly. A person just transitions into whatever the next area is of their life. In other words, what we know is that the brain is part of the illusion. It's part of the scenery. It's a reason, it's a place to put consciousness, but it isn't the place where consciousness resides. On the computer, we have the circle that goes around to show us that activities are being performed. We don't believe that the activities are in that circle. That circle has nothing to do with the activities. They're just there to let us know that the activities are being performed. That's what the brain is like.